Hi, everyone. This is Jack Allwild with another money episode. Today, I have special guest Justin Pogue on, who's the author of Rental Secrets. Justin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jack. Great to be here.
It's very, very cool to have you on. And before we get into your book, I like to start out by asking, what was your relationship with money growing up?
Yeah, absolutely. So growing up, I always had, what I needed, but I always had less than everybody around me. So, for example, my parents put me in private school, and my allowance for the week was $2 at the time. My best friend got 20.
Okay.
And we would, when we would go to school, we would drive up in a 10-year-old Datsun B210, and we'd park next to, luxury cars. So I kind of always had what I needed, and I got to school on time, and I could afford what I wanted from the snack bar most of the time.
Okay. I'm guessing by the fact that your parents put you in private school, they very much valued education.
Yes, absolutely. They absolutely valued education and learning about the world and being able to make your way in it. And our family's relationship with education has changed over time, as the value of education has changed and what people have been teaching in school has changed. But that's another topic for another time.
Yeah, so let's get into it. So how did you discover real estate? Why didn't you walk us through how that came to be?
I discovered real estate completely by accident. So when I originally left college, I went into a job where I was managing private security officers, like physical security on corporate campuses, for companies. And it was a 24/7 job. I showed up on the first day, here's a cell phone, here's a pager. And I did that job for 3 years. And at that point, I realized there's got to be a better way to do this. So I hatched my master plan. I was going to go to graduate school, get my MBA, and I was going to switch from what I was doing into management consulting.
Okay.
And I mean, the plan worked really well, except when I graduated, the dot-com bubble was in the process of imploding, and the management consulting industry was imploding right along with it at the same time. I mean, it was to the point where even people they had already hired, they were sending them rescission letters, and taking their offers back. So that's how bad it got. So my timing could not have possibly been any worse than it was. So that happened, came back home, but my mother had been a real estate agent back in the 80s, and she had always kind of dabbled in real estate. And she was at a point where she was ready to start buying and investing in real estate and all of that. And she was like, well, you got this degree, you don't have, your plan didn't work out. So let's just go look, let's just go look at a couple of properties. And that became a 20 plus year career in investing in real estate and buying old properties and rehabbing them and turning them into rentals and all of that. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Wow. So when I was reading your book, I was kind of like trying to go back and think, so this book is geared towards renters. And I don't think I'd ever read a book on real estate geared towards renters. So what caused you to write this book? What had you,
Yeah. So it's actually kind of an interesting story. So someone had suggested that I write a book, and I had no idea what writing a book meant, what that looked like. So I went to the bookstore. So I'm sitting in the real estate section. I'm looking at all the books there, and I see books for property investors, insurance agents, real estate agents, mortgage brokers, like everybody in the real estate industry, except for one group. And it was the renters, which I thought was really odd because they're the ones that are bringing over $500 billion a year to the table to pay rent and paying the salary for everybody who already had a book written for them. And I just thought that was crazy. Especially since renting is where most people start out in life when they graduate college or they finish high school and they get their first job. So knowing how to rent well and starting off on the right foot seemed to be one of those foundational pieces that people need to really make the most of their life and become the best version of themselves.
So, one thing right now, we're seeing inflation outpace a lot of salary growth rates. One part of the book that I thought was great is, as a landlord, when we're looking at comps, if you have a 2-bed, 1-bath, you're looking at 2-bed, 1-bath in your area. But for a renter, their alternatives are not just maybe in that area. Why don't you go into how a renter can use that as a negotiating tool?
Yeah, it's yeah. So part of my experience was working for a property management company, and they had this process of deciding how they were going to charge for the apartments that they had, and they would go out and they would do what they called comps, and they are deciding on properties that are comparable to theirs with similar amenities and within a certain radius of where their property is. And what renters have to understand is that process of finding comps has nothing to do with you. It's they're choosing what the comps are. But what renters should be doing is figuring out, what are my comps? What are the communities that I would choose to live in, whether they're on the east side of town or the west side of town, or by the north end or the south end. Get those prices and bring those prices into that meeting with your property manager about the renewal or renting this particular property. And that does a number of things for you. Number one, those prices, because you're choosing them, are going to end up being lower than what the asking price or what the renewal offer from that company is going to be. But secondly, since you're actually coming into the room with market data, you've set yourself apart from every other renter that's in their office whining about, oh, my rent's going up, it's too high, blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, not only do I feel it's too high, this is why. And it gives that property manager, who most likely doesn't have any power over the pricing individually, they've got to go to their regional manager. It gives them the ammunition they need when they go into that conversation with their boss about, well, this person objected to this rental because of these market comps that they have, that of properties that they are considering. That's a conversation that they can have with their boss. They can't take whining to their boss. So
I
it
mean,
really
as a
takes
sorry.
so it really takes kind of getting into the mind of the property manager and what their situation is and what they're dealing with to be able to make your case and save money on some rent.
Yeah, I was going to say, as a landlord, if someone were to bring their comps to me, I mean, it does become real, because it's a very binary thing, as you mentioned. It's either rented or it's not rented, and
Yeah.
it's not like. And you bring up the good point. It's not like there's some inventory you have that you can sell. If you miss out on those rental days, you miss out on those rental days forever.
Yeah.
So it makes it very real to a landlord, the possibility of having a vacancy and having to go through the turnover that's involved. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And every landlord is intimately familiar with the pain of going through a vacancy and going through a turnover, the cleaning, the repairing, the having to be available to meet people at the property so they can see it and walk them through it, and then vetting those people and getting credit checks and all there's this whole process to do it. And even once you go through the whole process as a landlord, I'm still rolling the dice on a new person. Whereas somebody who's already been in there, they've been in there for 3 years, they've paid their rent on time, they've handled, they've let me know when things are broken or are not working the right way, or there's some problem with a neighbor. Like, they're letting me know all this information. Like, having a renter that you can rely on to do their part is worth its weight in gold.
Absolutely. So, Justin, what would you say is the best source of info when renting?
Yeah, it's something. This is something that people are never really taught, but you're out there and you're renting, and you see an ad, you call, you set up an appointment, you go on a tour, and the property manager, talks to you about the site and, tells you it's the best thing since sliced bread and all that. But who you really need to talk to are the people who already live there. What's good, what's bad? Do they fix stuff when they're supposed to fix stuff? What's going on with this neighboring property across the fence? Is the park down the street really, really safe for my kids? The property manager is telling me that, I'll have to park my second car in the street. Well, is there actually street parking out there? Or am I going to have to walk a mile? Like, these are things that the people who already live there know, and they really have no stake in whether you rent there or not. So you can actually get really truthful, unvarnished information without all the spin, from the people who might be your future neighbors.
Awesome. And in what ways could a renter be flexible to get the best rental rate?
Yeah, so when you sign a lease for an apartment, there are certain terms that are going to be in there. So one of those terms is the date you move, and that's going to be specified in the lease. But sometimes, for example, apartment is being renovated and they may not get done with that apartment in time. So if you're flexible on your move-in date, you may be able to negotiate a better deal. Another opportunity is in terms of the term of your lease. So most landlords would like to have their leases expire at the beginning of summer, because that's the period of peak demand. But people don't always leave, at that point in time. So there are going to be vacancies that occur in, November, December. So if you as a renter, instead of, I just graduated from school, I need this great apartment and I need it right after graduation, if you can hold off for a few months, there's a good chance that you can get a better deal in November or December. And that, according to studies, that savings can be as much as 7%, depending on which city you're in and what type of apartment you're renting.
Awesome. Now, one thing in the latter half of the book you mentioned in the accounting part was this concept of usable life in terms of like carpets, paint. Can you go through that and what renters should know about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know it sounds boring because it's accounting, but the interesting part is when landlords when landlords put, let's say, carpet into an apartment, then let's say they pay $1,000 for that carpet. From the accounting perspective, it's assumed that that carpet will be used up over a period of time. And typically for carpet, that time is 5 years. So when you put down your security deposit, if you live in that apartment for a year and let's say the carpet is destroyed, they can't charge your deposit $1,000 for the carpet, because accounting assumes over that year you've used 1/5 or $200 of that $1,000. So the most they should be able to charge you on your deposit is $800. Now, knowing that, when you move out and you get your deposit itemization back, if they've charged you for $1,000 worth of carpet, you now know that you can push back on that, because you used it for a year, it should only be 800. But actually it gets better. So now if you're in this apartment for 5 years and the carpet's destroyed, they shouldn't charge you anything for it. Zero, nada, zip. And it doesn't matter what condition the carpet is in. And the same thing applies to paint. Now, actually, the actual paint on the walls, not holes in the walls. That's a different discussion. But if your kid scrawls, believes that they're Picasso and they scrawl all over the walls in your apartment, but you've been there for 2 years or more, the landlord shouldn't charge you for repainting the apartment either. So it really comes down to knowing what things you should be charged for in your security deposit and what things you shouldn't be charged for.
So this is something that's like legally they will enforce it this way?
Now, I'm not a lawyer,
Uh-huh.
so I cannot give legal advice. But what I can say is, having been a property manager, those are the rules that I was given by the company that I was working for. And it is an accepted accounting principle, and it does give you some standing to push back on those charges, should you go to court.
Gotcha.
So these are things that people need to be aware of, because quite frankly, as a landlord, or really anybody, I never want to go to court. Like, we should be trying to handle our situations outside of court. It's expensive for everybody and it's cumbersome, and landlords are acutely aware of that.
So Justin, if there's what question haven't I asked that you want me to ask right now about your book?
So what most people ask me about my book is on the chapter about how we get free rent.
Okay. How do we get
um,
free rent?
yeah, so people think like free rent is a fairy tale. It's this mythical unicorn that nobody can ever catch. But there are actually two ways to get free rent. And the first way is through marketing. So there are apartment complexes that will offer free rent, whether it be 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, when someone signs a lease. And the reason why they do that is because these buildings have a long lifespan. So I may be managing an older building, and there may be a bunch of newer buildings popping up around me, and everybody's all oohing and awing over the new buildings, and I'm not getting any foot traffic. And if I don't get any foot traffic, I can't rent an apartment, because I can't rent apartments that people don't come and see and look at and walk through and experience the community and all of that. So I may offer 2 weeks free rent just to get people's attention, because free rent cuts through all of the clutter. I mean, I don't care how great that new apartment building is. If there's one that's offering free rent, we're going to go take a look and see what options they provide. So that's the first way you get free rent. The second way you get free rent is actually working for the landlord as a property manager, or a maintenance person. And they do that as part of the compensation. And this is a really good strategy, especially for if you're a young couple with a child and you want one person to stay home. Because what happens is the person who stays home, let's say the rent for the apartment is $2,000 a month. If the person who stays home works for the property manager, responds to maintenance calls, is the first point of contact for their neighbors, that $2,000 in rent is at $2,000 a month is $24,000 a year. But it actually gets even better because that's after tax money. So if you were to earn that, you would need to go out into the world and get a job that makes $40,000. Oh, and you'd also have to make enough on top of that to cover daycare for your kid. So it's a really powerful strategy, if you could swing it. And there's turnover in the property management industry all the time. So look for those ads, look for those opportunities out there, because it is absolutely a real thing.
Now, someone that's listening to that and says, "Yeah, that sounds great," but do I need to be handy, or do I just need to be choreographing the handyman?
So one of the people I know who did this, he did not have any handyman experience up front, but he did buy some tools and keep them in his car when he went on these interviews. You could there was a book put out by Home Depot called the 1-2-3 Home Improvement Book, and in fact, when I first started remodeling apartments, that book was my go-to, like how to lay tile, how to install cabinets, how to put up sheetrock, like that's where I started. So you can certainly learn all of these skills. It's not like you have to be a licensed plumber or any of that. But if you can change a lock, I mean, you're well ahead of most people. But honestly, like, working for a property management company is more about, like, you're the first point of contact for your neighbors. You need to be there to let a vendor in who's repairing, who might need to be repairing something. You might need to, learn how to clean the pool, keep the curb appeal up, those kinds of things. Now, if you actually take on a maintenance person role, which can still lead to free rent, by the way, then yeah, you'll need to be a little more handy. And while this option isn't for everyone, because not everyone wants to give up their job to work for the property management company, but knowing that it's an option can certainly help a lot of people out there.
Awesome. Well, as we're winding down, Justin, I like to ask everyone, what's the best and worst personal finance advice you've either heard or received?
Yeah, so we'll start with the best. And the best advice that I've ever gotten is that your life doesn't change until you say yes to something. And saying yes to something can be risky. It can feel dangerous. But as we're seeing in our current inflationary environment, doing nothing can also be dangerous. So the worst financial advice I would say is, well, actually, I'd say most financial advice is bad. And the reason why I say that is because most of it is, assume you make $100,000 a year, cut out restaurant dining, save that money in an index fund, and in 40 years, you too can be a millionaire. But realistically, like, the average per capita income in the US is just over 40,000. So that doesn't fit most people. And that's why I wrote Rental Secrets and started my podcast, Renter Confidential, to focus on people where they're at. So most people are at, I make 40K, rent's due on Friday. How do I make this work? And since that's where most people are at, that's where I wanted to focus, the advice and the information that I was giving out from my experience.
Awesome. Well, Justin, I thoroughly enjoyed your book. Why don't you tell the listeners where they can go get the book, and where else can they find you?
Yeah, so Rental Secrets is available at Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, and all the fine retailers across the internet and cyberverse. You can also find me at rentalsecrets.net and on the podcast Renter Confidential, where we actually bring the book Rental Secrets to life.
Awesome. Well, I had a great time talking with you, Justin, and I think the listeners are going to get a lot of value out of this one.
Thanks, Jack. Glad to add value for your audience.